Welcome back to the channel. Today's lesson is called Catching the Wave and the Effortless Swing. So, what is the wave? Well, the wave is that sequencing of energy that we've talked about in the kinetic chain, that if we lower our mass and sink into the ground, then yes, we have a process of energy transfer from the ground up. And that process goes through each of our 32 rotational segments in our kinetic chain. We don't always talk about each of them, but that's how many there are. And they're all in rotation to one degree or another. And that rotation passes the energy up in a series of waves, or in helical circles that we'll talk about, until it reaches the arm and then extends out to the hand. And as we get to the turn of the swing, and we make even a sharper upward turn of the hand and the body, the racket extends out on the swing circle and accelerates around the curve, like the water skier going around the water ski boat that turns. So the wave is when we sync up the process of this building of energy through our body and out into our arm and hand, and just catch it, the wave just building and cresting right at the turn of the swing. And if we can sync our movement in our arm and our racket path in that wave, we get what some instructors call the free ride of the arms. That's catching the wave. And that's the effortless part of the swing. Catching the wave look like in a tennis swing? Well, it just so happens I was filming one of our GOAT candidates, Novak Djokovic, one day, and as I reviewed the footage this week, I realized that I had captured the exact topspin forehand swing that he used to win his last point in his Olympic gold medal match over Carlos Alcaraz. It was a step around inside in topspin forehand, a beautiful shot, and I'll play it for you here. Of course, the GOATs have spent years in refining their technique and learning how to sync their swing with the catching of the wave. But this is not something, a skill that's beyond an average player if they have some instruction. You know, even dogs can catch waves, as we've seen in the dog surfing contest in the image behind me. Well, there is such a thing as goat surfing as well. And that's what we're going to learn, Goat Surfing 101. You're not going to want to miss this instruction. So before we get to wave catching and goat surfing, I want to take a few moments to explain my approach to instruction on goat tennis. As some viewers have been saying, you know, why do your instructions take an hour when everybody else is taking 5 minutes? Okay, that's a fair question. And why do you seem to make things so complicated when the other guys make it so simple? Another fair question. So I want to take the time to explain this, and I think it'll be set us up well for understanding wave catching. So Einstein said, Einstein's rule is that things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So my problem with most of traditional tennis instruction is that it's too simple. It violates Einstein's rule. Just looking at the human body and where traditional tennis instruction focuses, they only focus on one part of the body. That's the arm and the hand. Secondly, traditional tennis instruction, for the most part, ignores the kinetic chain process, which is the process that science uses to describe the generation of power and speed in all movement sports. This slide sort of sums up all my objections to traditional tennis instruction. So 95% of tennis instruction focuses just in this arm and hand area and doesn't really explain why we move this and where we move it. Well, sometimes it explains where we move it in terms of various positions in the swinging process, but I call this positions without principles because it's just the outer map of what the person's doing, and without understanding the inner feels and principles, it's really not going to be something that anyone can really duplicate. And finally, the overall context from traditional tennis instruction is one that tennis is a completely unique movement and unique sport. And as I've described it, this is not correct, that really have an underlying foundation for swinging, and that's the throwing action. And in my video, Born to Throw, Born to Swing, I described the 2 million years of evolution that we had as hunter-gatherers, where man found that throwing objects and spears and being killed at a distance was a huge evolutionary advantage. And our bodies over 2 million years evolved such that our shoulder complex and arm and everything was totally unique, and we became by far the best and most accurate throwers in the animal kingdom. So all of that understanding seems to be pretty much thrown out the window by traditional tennis instruction that believes that tennis is in this complete unique position in the world context. It's almost like they think that man evolved for 2 million years to be able to serve a tennis ball or hit a topspin forehand. Really doesn't make a lot of sense. So the approach I've taken in goat tennis is that we have to look at the entire kinetic chain and all the body parts, and really look at this swing as being led and driven by the body. These are the main muscles and power sources and engines within our body, not our arm and hand. So those are the engines that must drive and should drive the swing, not the other way around. But beyond the kinetic chain, as in my official title for this series, the kinetic whip model, there's a special dynamic of the transfer of energy at the last part of the kinetic chain from the hand into the racket release. This is where we get the whip-like acceleration, the 3 or 4 times the speed that our hand can move around the body. Our racket head can move 3 or 4 times faster if we have the right form and use the right technique. So understanding that and how that's the end goal of this swinging process in the topspin forehand, that's vital to the whole approach to instruction. In this next picture in the background, I can't vouch for the artistry of the drawing as I did it myself, but I think it is a good representation of the kinetic chain process, where we see a bunch of parts from our lower body to our upper body all in rotation. And the wave of energy moves, up in this helical, swaying, swirling manner. Combined, we'll talk about later, the spirals of the body, and then moves out to the shoulder, and then out to the arm, and then out to the hand. And then we have the acceleration of the whip release. And you can see that the green, what represents the energy mapping of the kinetic chain, starts fairly small at the beginning and moves up. As it moves up, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker until we have a big green swath in the catching of the wave action in the whip release. So if all this is looking and sounding very strange to you, and you may be wondering, hey Kim, where's the proof of this vision you have? Well, the proof is in all the kinematic sequencing studies that have been done by scientists in all these different sports. And in the background here, you can see sort of a standard kinematic sequence diagram. And you can see that the speed of the segments moves in waves. You know, the lower waves start to accelerate, hips start to accelerate, then they start to deaccelerate. Then the chest accelerates, deaccelerates. The shoulder accelerates and deaccelerates. The hand and the arm accelerates and deaccelerates. Finally, the racket accelerates through in the whip release. And so that basic dynamic is true in all swing sports. So how can you prove that last statement to yourself? Well, if you do a Google image search with the terms I've listed here, golf, kinematic sequence diagram, baseball, tennis, you will see that science has done hundreds and hundreds of these kinematic studies and measurements, particularly in golf and some in baseball. There's a few in tennis, but they're only a handful, and that goes to what I've been saying for some time now, is that tennis is behind these other sports in the scientific understanding and measurement of the swing. But go and prove that for yourself. Take a moment, do those searches, and you'll see the vast number of scientific measurements, particularly of golf. So looking at a kinematic sequence of the tennis topspin forehand, but this time I've converted the vertical axis that was showing revolutions per second, which is the way science standard way of measuring speed in rotational movements. I've converted it to miles per hour, just as this is something that we have a much better everyday understanding of, and it's generally accurate. So you see that the lower wave, the pelvis wave, again, we're not only measuring 4 segments here, not the 32 that are available because it's just too complicated. You can see that the pelvis is only moving maybe 5 miles an hour, maybe less. The chest is maybe moving 10 miles an hour, maybe less. And then it moves up to eventually out to the hand that I've talked about many times now as it goes around. And we think the hand is going much faster than it really is. Its maximum is at the beginning of the forward swing. It's only going maybe 20 miles an hour at maximum, usually a lot less. Then as we reach the turn of the swing, then the racket head swings out on the circle through angular momentum, not by linear momentum of throwing our hand at the target, but by the turning and twisting of our body and hand and arm that sends the racket out on this throwing on edge path that we've talked about, the windshield wiper path. That's where we get the real acceleration, and that's where we're talking about when catching the wave. The wave icon into this kinematic sequence of the topspin forehand, we see that just like in the ocean, the wave is slowly building, but we don't really see it that much until it sort of reaches the shore. Well, in this case, it's the hand that we finally see the wave emerging with some speed. It's still only going 20 miles an hour. And that's the moment at the turn of the swing that we need to sink our actions into to allow the momentum being released by our rotating body flow out through our arm into the racket handle and eventually out to the flinging racket. I talked about the slinging racket. That's the dynamic action that we're after, but we have to talk about how we build this wave and how we sync up to this wave. Speaking within the context of the kinetic chain dynamic, we have to create the wave before we catch the wave. So creating the wave is the effort part of the effortless swing. And that's what Roger Federer was trying to say to the Dartmouth graduates this year in his commencement speech. You know, Roger was known for this effortless style of play that everyone always talked about, the Baryshnikov of tennis, etc. And he was telling them that, yes, that's the impression I wanted to convey and the way I wanted to play, but I had to work very hard to create that style of play. And so we have to move away from our traditional sort of vertical stance, rigid posture, standing straight and swinging like this. You know, we have to adopt a much more athletic mode of being, you know, with a athletic posture, a tilt of the spine, and we'll also talk about some new dimensions of that athleticism in this current lesson. So we create the wave with our body and with our form. So we have all of these spiraling elastic muscle tendon structures that we've talked about in the past and are talking about again today. But we're also talking about, as well as, you know, stretching these muscles and tendons and body parts, we also have to learn about bending and twisting these parts. And this is what we're going to take up next. Now, you haven't probably played with one of these toys since you were a kid, but this is the kind of thing we do in instruction. We have lots of fun doing it. So this is my Captain Storm balsa wood airplane, and it's powered by a rubber band down here at the bottom of the fuselage. And you can see that it's only slightly stretched, but this stretch alone doesn't provide any power for my airplane. So the propeller here is not doing anything. This thing is never going to fly just with a stretch. But now, if we add a twist to the stretch, then we have a different story. So as I wind up and twist this rubber band, as you can see, getting up close here, how much it's twisting, and I can feel the dynamic energy of this connection here between my two hands is increasing the torsion, twisting force on this rubber band. So this is that twisting force, that torsion, is something that we want to do throughout our body. We want to do it in the big parts of our body, through our pelvic, chest, shoulders area. We want to do it in our shoulder, our hitting arm, shoulder and wrist and forearm. All should be adding twisting power to the stretching power that we put into the swing. And even into our legs and how we put pressure into the ground, there's going to be a twisting and torsion component of that we'll get into in detail. And let me say specifically about, we've talked about traditional tennis instruction, why I dislike this whole concept of the unit turn so much, is that basically usually the instructor just says, well, do a good unit turn, but doesn't really describe what that really means. So what that means in their world is just simply that the shoulders and hips are turning in unison at the beginning of the initial take back. Well, that's only a third of the loading phase of our swing, but usually that's when traditional tennis instruction drops it. And we really haven't accomplished that much. So if we turn our shoulders and our hips together and turn to the side and then drop our hands here, our body is not loaded in any real way for releasing a swing. So this action is something that we've read from the beginning. We have to think about loading and coiling and spiraling up, as we'll talk about, to get the proper load, proper twist and turns in our body of the stored energy. And so in terms of catching the wave, once we have enough stored energy in our coils and our twisting, you know, we can release that energy like almost effortlessly, like hopefully this plane flies. So we'll see. Well, it flew for a little while, and it threw from the unwinding and of the torsion that I put into that rubber band, and that's what we're going to do with our swing. Well, not only do we coil and twist some of the finer parts of our body, like our hitting forearm and wrist and whatnot in this cocking position, and you know, in our shoulder complex, but the major muscle groups we also coil and twist to some degree in order to store and release more energy. And so I have this little exercise bar that I've shown you before, that usually we're twisting to strengthen our forearm or something like that. But if we just bend this exercise bar and release it, we get some nice springy release of energy, and that's what we want in terms of bending our body and the major muscle groups. But then if we add a twist to that bended form, we get even a bigger release of energy because we've stored more energy. So in this twisting, turning mode, this torsion movement that we do with our body and our major muscle groups, we get quite a bit more stored energy that we can then release. And this all goes to transforming our actions on the tennis court from an unathletic vertical stance, or standing erect and swinging horizontally, to a much more tilted and bended and spiraling form. That's the only way our swing is going to get 25 to 30%, 5% vertical through the contact zone that we need for a good topspin swing. So we're never going to get there with this vertical stance and this horizontal swing path. Virtually impossible. We have to get into a much more athletic, dynamic spiraling mode, a twisted mode, and a bended mode to unbend in the proper release of this swing. So let's look at this side view of Roger Federer's topspin forehand as our first pass through the movement map. We'll get into more complexity as we go along. But right here at the start, you see a different Roger Federer than, as I've said in most YouTube videos, where he's casually warming up, standing vertically, kind of swatting the ball around like this. You know, that is not his true hitting and athletic mode. You see it here where he is in a athletic posture, tilted, knees bent, flexed, energy in his body, and he's ready to move. And this is the way we need to think about tennis from beginning to end, is in this much more athletic, dynamic mode of being. Now, up until this point, we've been working with kind of large circle movements of the phases of the swing, where we just talked about, you know, the out move, you know, moving back up into a take back position. And we didn't worry too much about the detail. Well, we're worrying about more detail in this lesson. So instead of just the out move, now I want you to think spiral out and up. So remember, the swing center in the middle of our chest is that we want to make a movement in a centered sort of way from this pivot point in the middle of our chest. But we don't want to just turn horizontally as we typically do when we're in our recreation mode, standing straight. If we have the inclination to rotate, it's usually on this circular plane. Nor do we want to do this spiraling move simply in a tilted Ferris wheel plane. You know, that's a one-dimensional movement. It's better than the circular one, but it's still not what we want. So we want a spiraling motion. And we begin to build this right from the beginning, from our ready position. And so what are we spiraling? So our right hip complex is spiraling up, as you can see in the illustration here with Federer in the background. And our chest and our ribs and our hitting arm are also spiraling up. Yes, the ribs are spiraling up. They're not just turning horizontally. So we're spiraling up with our shoulder and in our ribs to this position. And now we're gathering and building the energy, the twisting torsion energy in our upper chest area, in our shoulder area, in our back, by this spiraling up move. We'll go into more detail. Now, we don't want to overdo it at this point. We're just the beginning of the swing, but there is, you know, the beginning of a feeling of loading as opposed to the unit turn and drop passively mode. We're spiraling up and gathering our coiled energy up here. And keeping with the new level of our movement, we're not just from handbrake, doing an out and then an in movement, we're spiraling in and down, spiraling in and down. And so we're incorporating that spiral in our back, our shoulder, our side bend, our loading in our hip. So we're at handbrake and we're feeling the coil in our lats, lower shoulder scap area as we side bend. We're bending and creating stored energy. We're not just dropping the racket here passively, spiraling down and back, and we're spiraling our hitting arm, forearm, and wrist. So in other words, there's a subtle twisting back of the forearm and wrist and hand into this essentially cocked position that we've been talking about. So from the perspective of here, well, this would probably be a better perspective. There's the target here, and the racket is coiled and the tip is pointed to the back side fence, not just to the side fence. Sometimes you don't get all the way coiled, and that's just the way it is. But again, we're going to try to load as much as we can. So, and this is the reason that in all throwing and swinging actions, there's a cocking movement. So the forearm and the wrist are twisted back in this manner and form. And we'll get into this more detail later, but we've talked about it quite a bit, is that you really feel a stretch and a twist back here, and you should feel it. You know, it could be very dynamic and smooth, but still we're loading back there. And we're also loading the big parts of our body in this spiral in and down move with a side bend and a keeping our non-hitting arm out in back of us to some degree, so that we feel a little stretch in our lower non-hitting side and back. And the side bend, again, is another twisting move that we have to start to get comfortable with. Then we talked about, as we do this side bend, how our lead hip shifts and our weight starts to move into our lead side in what is going to be the spiral out move. So there's quite a few things happening in this movement, and all of it has a little bit to do with twisting and coiling. And we have to practice this, and we have to get comfortable with it. And in our final phase of the topspin forehand, what we used to call just the out move, now we're calling it spiral down and in. Spiral down and in. And letting the spiraling move go from beginning to ending. And as we get this smoother and smoother, it's going to go faster and faster and be a more efficient stroke for you. So now I'll play 2 video clips of Federer and Djokovic from the rear perspective, from down the line perspective, so you can see this movement a little bit more clearly from that perspective perhaps. And each phase is identified, and there's a freeze moment, so you can sort of really get an understanding again of this dynamic. So there's really no call to talk through this. I'll just play this through for you right now. Now I want to look at Jack Sock's spiraling form, and we'll go through this in a couple different ways. But the first thing is, again, this spiral up, and he has more of a bent and twisted posture and athletic mode than Federer and Djokovic, who still had remnants of the old sort of a more erect posture when they were swinging. And they'd like to be as vertical as they could be, even though they would bend and get into their hitting posture when they had to, of course. But Jack Sock is more of the next generation, you know, where you're going to see more of this hunched turning back. You see a little bit more of his back as he turns, and he's dipping and bending his body more. And the thing that I want you to pay attention to in this sequence is really the level of the shoulder, as opposed to the recreation mode where the shoulders always stay level because we're just standing here vertically swinging around this merry-go-round. Now we're in a spiraling mode, and so every time this spiraling move changes, the level of the shoulders will change. And that's one way you can check yourself if you're beginning to develop this skill. When you watch your videos or in the mirror or your partner's talking, you'll say, well, you just stayed level the whole time. And that's not what we want. We want the shifting of the body and the shoulder levels to show up. And in the second stage, the spiral in and down phase from handbrake, we see how much the body is being transformed at the core level, where he goes into his side bend, and now his hitting shoulder is much, much lower than his non-hitting shoulder. Whereas it was before when he did the initial take back up here, now it's way below here. So there's a very dramatic shifting and bending and side bending and twisting of the torso here as he loads back into the slot position. Phase, the spiral out and up phase from the slot. I want you to again focus on this fact that we've gone from this tilted, bended position in the slot, but now as we move out on this, coming up through our spiral here, there's going to be a rising of the torso in this unbending mode. It doesn't mean that we want to straighten up like we talked about as a bad thing that Coco Gauff is doing as she is in her hitting posture and then straightens up. We want to avoid that, but there is a natural rising of the torso as we stay in our form of a spiral. And we have, of course, the non-hitting anchor point in our torso that we've talked about, non-hitting internal shoulder rotation tuck, that's going to break this rotation on our non-hitting side so our hitting side can spiral up faster and through. The one thing we haven't really talked about is what's going on with the lower half. And so oftentimes with the pros, you'll see them, leap into the air in a scissoring action. And so their left side is seemingly unanchored, and that would lead to the hips rotating and spinning around too much. So how do the pros stop that? Well, they stop it with an internal hip rotation. And I can't really demonstrate it that well in terms of actual scissoring, but external rotation would be moving my leg out to the side here. Internal rotation is this movement, inside. So as they're scissoring, this inside leg is internally rotating to create the block even in the air. The final spiral in and down phase, we see even that Sock's non-hitting hand is extended out like this in this sort of braking motion. So still the remnants of this left side brake is still in mode of being here with Sock, even though as his right side momentum carries him around to the side and back and down, his hand is still here. It's not something that you really have to worry about, but it's just keeping the concept that this non-hitting side is braking and arresting the rotation for the spiraling hitting side to go through as efficiently as possible. Now using Sock's form again, I want to focus on the sort of more the energy movement map of catching the wave. So in this slide, I've added some 3D graphics around the body to convey the importance of this shifting and bending and torsion that we want in the large parts of our body in the spiraling motion. We don't want to forget about the core of the body. And yes, you know, our chest and ribs and shoulder complex are spiraling up, gathering energy up here. And we're also going to be shifting our weight back into our trail leg. And again, if we have time and is appropriate, we can shift some energy into that trail buttocks and glute, which is the largest muscle, most powerful in our body. So we want that external rotation of the femur of the leg in the hip socket down this way. Sometimes you can do it a little, sometimes a lot, sometimes not at all. But we're always looking to try to load this if we can. So that's another incentive for early preparation that we've talked about in other places. Early preparation will give you the time to load. Even maybe a little here, it's going to make a big difference in your swing. As again, this is the most powerful part of our body. And in phase 2, the spiral in and down from handbrake with the side bend. There's so many things going on with a coiling of our bending and twisting of our body, the side bending, coiling, twisting and cocking back of our hitting arm, wrist and hand. You know, this is that cocking move that we've been talking about. We have the lateral bump. We have the side bend supposed to give us coiled energy to connect our hitting arm with our rotating body, spiraling body, but also to give us room for our arm swing to come from inside out. If we don't have the side bend, very difficult to get an inside out swing path, which is critical to a high level swing. So all these things are important to work on and be taken up separately. So we've talked in the movement from the slot a lot about the arm movements and how we want to sequence release of this energy in the master move with the arm. We won't go into that again. Focus now on the larger parts of the spiral, the lower swing center and the upper swing center, and how as we are in our bent, coiled, and drop position here, the first thing that is going to start is going to be the release of our spiral hips movement. And while the hips start to unwind, we often have another little pullback of the back coil of the upper hitting area. Not always, but if we have time and we can do it, we should do it. We can draw in our hitting arm more into that slotted position as the hips have started to unwind. But at some point, you know, as the hips start to unwind and they start to slow down and eventually become arrested by the other movements that we've been talking about, the upper half of the body is going to want to unwind, and we let it unwind against the first snapping of the pelvis and lower half. Then we're going to have a spiraling centered turn around the upper half. And so we want to ensure that, remember we talked about the center turn of these two swing centers, and we had the exercise of the butt back exercise where we had the chair back here. And what we want to avoid is the tendency of all players, recreation and pros, talked about with Coco, is there's a tendency in this spiraling, rotating action to have the hitting side and hitting pelvis extend too much forward and too aggressively to the target, because that's just our mentality. We usually have a linear model where we're always thinking about moving towards the target with our hand and our body. And so as soon as we start to get into that mentality, driving with our right side too much, then we're moving our swing center, lower swing center, several inches forward, making our point of contact very dicey, very inconsistent, and actually robbing us of power as well, because as our body moves forward like this, we're straightening up and losing the ability to have a torqued swing around a fixed center point. So we have to keep some focus on this idea of a centered turn, and one way we can do it is don't think about initiating the rotation or spiral from this right side, which is our natural inclination, our dominant side, pulling out, but think more of pulling in with the non-hitting hip inside, just like in our butt back exercise. And we're trying to, as the right cheek buttocks comes off in this spiraling movement, the left one should be rotating back and touching the chair, not extending out, but a centered turn. And so just the swing thought of pulling with the left side, and there's even a little pulling with the non-hitting hand side that you can think about as a keeping the center turn rather than letting the right side become so dominant. So the whole idea of pulling with the non-hitting side, both top and bottom, will help us do a center turn. And as we move out on the swing circle in the runway, as I called it, we get to the turn of the swing, and this is the takeoff portion where we're going to have to produce a much more vertical swing path in our spiraling action. But here's where all this body energy that we've been building in the spiral now is flowing out through our arm, into our hand, into the handle that's lagging us, and then into the final twisting and pulling of the racket handle around the curve. So we're not extending our racket or our hand towards the target in any way. This is just a fundamentally wrong, poor technique that's advocated. And there's nothing more important than, so where do we move our hand? So if traditional tennis is telling you to move your hand to the target, I say that's a poor technique. In every other swing sport, there's a curved path of the hand, just as there is obviously a curved path, a spiral of the racket, which is attached to the hand. How could it be otherwise? So we don't want to interrupt that curving path. We want to accentuate it and make it as smooth as possible. But again, the turn of the swing, that's when the whole wave has caught up, and we're now riding that wave in our swing. So we're not trying to then manipulate and overtake the action with our arm and hand, which is the recreation mode, and try to do some funny control of contact. So we're back to the principles that we talked about in the Zen of contact, in the sense that we're working with the laws of physics. We're working with the tide. We're working with the wind, not fighting it. And we're in sync with that. And it becomes this flowing, beautiful, arcing release of energy out, spiraling out through their hand. And even as I demonstrate in the ball toss, the final twisting and pronation of the forearm as we move through contact, we don't have to consciously do that. We just let the spiraling form do that for us, and it will come out just about perfect. You know, again, if we have the right swing path and the right form that we're releasing, that we haven't straightened up or done some other, poor thing with our body. Then, of course, we have the final spiral in and down, typically down. Sometimes it's up here, I agree, but most of the time it's sort of a spiral up and down. And that's the 4 phases in the new spiral mode. So that's the movement map of this new level of the swing that we're working on. So we're moving from large circles of just saying out and in to now a spiral up and in, and adding a lot of sophistication to the points that we should focus on during that swinging process. So we're moving higher and higher, ascending Goat Mountain here, and getting to another level of skill as we work our way up to the goats, up to the experts on this mountain for our topspin forehand. Deliberate. We're now in our deliberate practice section of the lesson, and I hope that by now you've invested in this $20 type tripod with a cell phone holder so that you can take this as your portable training environment to your bedroom, to your backyard, out to the court. You can play these sequence of exercises that I'm recommending, and you can get yourself, film yourself as well, and get the objective feedback that we need as part of the deliberate practice. So we have to remember that, quote, the feel is not real. The feel that you have is the way you felt in the past with your everyday sort of movement that we've been talking about, and this sort of vertical stiff posture. That's what feels comfortable. That's what feels, quote, natural. But in sports, in sport training, we're moving out of that old feeling to new feelings. So we're going to be in a much more dynamic, athletic movement posture and state of movement in general. And so those are the new reels that we're trying to access and then trying to practice. So that's why you need the camera, or you need a coach to give you that objective feedback and really query yourself. Is that really the new feel that I want in this new technique? So, you know, again, the central message is the old feel is not the real feel that we want. We're looking for the new feel, and we need objective feedback. So while we're talking about the beginning of the lesson, we always begin with talking about taking injury prevention seriously. And I have a bunch of recommendations that I want to go over with you again. So I have my list here that I'll show on the screen. Is we don't want to do any of these exercises if you're injured or really sore. Just don't do them. Wait till you're healthy before you try. You should stop any exercise immediately if you feel any pain or soreness, and get some feedback on what you may be doing wrong or the time you need to recover. And do all of these exercises in our new athletic posture and being. This is going to give us the ability to rotate from our mid-back area where we have some rotation and bending capability, not in our lumbar spine that's built for stability, not for rotation and flexibility. So we always have to be doing everything in an athletic posture. And just generally, even though you may want to go through the first series of exercises and sort of walk through them, if you will, just because you want to see the whole flow and how it's going to end up, doesn't mean that you should do everything full bore the first day. You should go through them slowly. The next day assess, how do you feel? Can I keep going? Can I speed it up? And so just be conservative in the way that you're approaching your training. It's going to work out the best in the long run and save you a lot of time for in terms of being injured or being on the sidelines. In this first set of exercises, I want to have you use your pillow that we created as our weighted ball. If you don't have the pillow, you might could use a basketball or something like that. Pillow with our bag of three 1-pound bags. About a 3-pound bag is about perfect in my opinion. If it's a little heavier or a little lighter, that's okay. We're just adding this much more substantial weight than a 10-ounce racket in our hand to give us the feeling of body dynamics that we're looking for, especially in the core of our movement. So I want you using your weighted pillow or ball. You know, we were in our athletic posture, in our ready position, and we're going to do the first spiral out and up move. And try to, thinking about our focus is on the core centering motion in our swing center here. And we're going to not just move on this horizontal plane that we typically will move on in any rotational movement. We're going to be on this spiral up plane, and we're going to feel things move. We're going to feel it's kind of a spiraling up and concentration of energy in our right hip. We're going to feel a spiral up of our ribs. So the ribs do have the ability to have some rotation in them, mostly from being attached to our mid-back. And the muscles in our shoulder complex can spiral up. And that's the first move in our new sequence. So the second part of it is, of course, the spiral down and in from the handbrake. Of course, we're not breaking our hands with the pillow, but we want to see if we can keep that stretch and extension as we reach back here a little, and then the folding in and the side bending of our torso and the shift of weight into our lead side. So there's a bit of a recentering move here, and we're coiling back our hitting arm such that we are preparing for this inside out swing in the next phase. So phase 3, we talked about many times from the slot, and we're going to not turn again, spin our hips or spin our torso and arms immediately, fire, load and explode, none of that. Remember, we have a sequence swing. So we're starting momentum out here to the right on the runway, and it's not until we get to the turn of the swing here that the wave of energy is cresting, and then we're riding this up and around. So that'll be phase 3 of this exercise. And of course, the last part is just the spiraling in of the arms. So in particular, your focus should be on the core of your body rather than your hands and exactly what they're doing. And you want to feel how this weight and this shifting weight around your body is pulling and tugging on the core of your body and your lower swing center and your upper swing center. And that as you move this thing out quickly, you'll feel that this is pulling your body out. And in order to do it smoothly, you have to resist that in the core of your body, but cooperate with it at the same time. So as you're going to feel as you throw this out that this weight is going to carry you out in that way. And to keep in balance, you'll have to resist that in the core of your body. So those are the feelings that we're looking for in this first set of exercises. 10 reps, pausing between each rep to see how you can do it better. And I'll pause the video. In the next series in this progression, I want you to do our new spiral exercises without the racket in your hands, without the weighted pillow, so that we are having to sort of recreate these feels just with our body and our arms. But we're trying to create the same feelings that we had with the pillow. So again, we don't want to just be moving our arms. We don't want to just be going horizontal. We want to feel a coil and a drawing up of energy into our arms as we do the spiral out and in. Spiral out and in. And the same with the rest of the motions that we're doing. We don't want to lose the feeling of how the energy is moving out, and we're balancing that in the core of our spiral through the core of our body. And our arms are just flowing around our body while we're maintaining that balance and the core integrity of that motion. So 10 reps, slow motion, pausing between each to see if you can improve. I'll pause the video. In our third progression, as we normally do, we move to picking up our racket, and we're going to keep in mind all the principles that we've always talked about: athletic posture, ready position, proper grip, hopefully a Western or semi-Western grip in our fingers, not in our palm. And there's a feeling of being able to cooperate with this spiraling movement in our hand even. And again, we don't want to lose this clamping our wrist in a frozen position. That's the old feel. We're going for new feels. So again, we're going to try for the same principles that we did in the feels for the first two set of exercises. But once we pick up the racket, we tend to go back to our old feels. And that's what we want to resist. So we want to feel a little bit exaggerated maybe in this spiraling motion. So maybe the spiral is sort of exaggerated. That's fine in this instance. What we don't want to do is go back to our old feels and our old movements. So that usually involves some level of exaggeration at the beginning. And that's what we should be doing. And we're going to see if we can let this, in this pulling motion that we have right from the beginning, have the racket always trailing our hand and extending out on the swing circle once we get to the spiral out and up on its own, rather than us sort of taking over with our arm and our hand. We're going to let the pulling motion of the body, the core of the body in our spiral motion, do this. Now I just demonstrated that at not slow speed, but I want you to do these in slow motion, pausing between each. And maybe you go to medium fast, medium speed at the last 5 after you've done it in slow motion. That's fair enough. Pausing between each, seeing if you can improve, keeping all the principles and feels. I'll pause the video. So we're moving up in levels of sophistication and skill and understanding and feeling as we move through these progressions, like we've started from the very beginning of this topspin forehand series. We sort of recreate that same ascending level of skill and complexity in each lesson. So that's what we're doing now, and that's what you should be doing with your deliberate practice. So this next exercise I call the continuous loop of energy, which is something I got from some of the top pitching sites that I subscribe to, where they talk about the flow of pitching as being gathering this loop of energy in the throwing action and letting that loop of energy flow up into your spiraling arm and out through your spiraling throwing motion. And it's a good thing to practice, and that's what I want to do here, is except we're doing it in our topspin forehand form and with a racket. So now we're really trying to feel the right connection between the racket and our hand as the energy wave that we've been talking about flows up and around us. So we want to be a little bit even lighter in our grip than perhaps we have been. And we're going to be letting this racket always be driven by a pulling action of the arm and the shoulder and the body. So the racket is always lagging behind the hand. And instead of thinking about each phase carefully and making sure that we do each little piece, and that's appropriate for the first levels, now we're into a different level of training. Now we're working on the smoothness and the overall continuity of the movement, the continuous loop of energy. And so that's the principal feel that we're trying to feel, which is that we're gathering energy in this looping form, the spiraling form, and we're letting it flow in its natural dynamic with the spiraling action of our body. And we're not going to slow down or change the rhythm. We're going to go at medium speed for this drill, because again, we don't want to go super fast because we lose our feeling that way. We still want to do it slow enough so we can have access, but fast enough that we can really feel the dynamic of the movement. So we're trying to feel a continuous loop of energy in each phase. You might have to pause between each one. Say, okay, what broke down? Did I suddenly, change my form to get to a certain position? We don't want that. We want the whole form to flow. So I'll pause for the continuous loop of energy, medium speed, 10 reps. I'll pause the video. This next progression is called catching the wave, as it should be. So we're going to keep the form and the feeling of the continuous loop of energy, but now we're going to start to feel more the building and the cresting of the wave as we reach the turn of the swing. So we're focused on the continuous looping of energy, but we're also focusing on how much of the kinetic wave energy we're building in our body and our form, and whether this is coming to a head at the turn of the swing so that we can just sink and let that flow and happen for us, rather than some manipulation of the racket, arm-led action at that point. Everything is going to flow from our spiral form, and we're going to see if different levels of bending and depth that we have in our form, and see if one works better for you when you catch this wave there. So it's 10 medium speed reps of catching the wave. I'll pause. In the final exercise, I want you to take what we've been doing, the catching the wave exercise, out to the court, even though we're not on the court now. And I want you to hit 10 balls fed by your partner or the ball machine, where they're feeding it to your forehand side without movement. We're just really focused on the feel of this new feel of this swing. We don't want any movement or complexity in it at this point. So the idea is a medium speed swing out of the line of fire of your partner, of course, and we're having the continuous loop of energy and focused on catching the wave at the turn of the swing with different levels of movement and bending and twisting, pausing between each one, really seeing if we can transfer the energy that we've been talking about, the wave of energy from the body out to the shoulder, out to the arm, out to the hand at the turn of the swing. And feel like the body is doing all the work and that our arms are along for the free ride as we sink our arm motion into this plane of motion, this spiraling plane of motion. And see if you can catch the wave while you're hitting the ball. I'll pause the video. That's the end of our catching the wave and effortless swing lesson. So you have to ask yourself, after all these exercises, did I catch the wave? Did it feel a little bit more effortless? Maybe yes, maybe no. Whichever it is, you should assess where your technique may be the weakest and make that the focus of your next deliberate practice session, and the one after that. Keep working on this in a deliberate way. But if you did happen to catch the wave, then you should give your training partner the shaka, surf sign. So the shaka sign embodies the spirit of aloha, representing friendship, understanding, and good vibes within the surf culture. And I say, even if you didn't catch the wave, you can still give your tennis friends this sign after you hit one. Now, they may think that you're getting stranger and stranger, but that's okay. Goat surfing isn't for everyone.